Back in episode 149, I reviewed a game that I actually have personal history with in the original Batman for the Genesis. Now, I believe I talked about it a little bit in that video, but just for simplicity's sake, Batman was the first time that I ever played a Mega Drive game. Or wait, was it not Batman but Fat Man? Believe it or not, that's actually a serious rhetorical question because both of those games were the first time that I ever saw a Mega Drive title, as my uncle who introduced me to both of them back in the day had imported them from Japan and actually had his Genesis cartridge slot widened so that the cartridges would fit. Clearly, Batman was the better of the two games, as you'll find out when I get around to reviewing Slaughter Sport, the name that Fat Man was renamed to when it made it to North America about a year later. The original Batman, as you can probably discern from the cover art, was based on the revolutionary 1989 film, and it was a fantastic action game, especially when you consider that it was originally released in July of 1990 in Japan, making it a pretty early release on the console. In fact, I've got Batman as one of the few, the proud, the games that have been awarded 4 stars on the channel. So having said that, you'd probably think that I'd be very excited to review Sunsoft's follow-up to Batman, Batman Returns, based around the sequel to Batman that made it to theaters in the summer of 1992. There's just one little teensy tiny problem with that. You see, Sunsoft didn't make Batman Returns. Somehow, Sega managed to get the license to Batman Returns instead, and they handled the release of the game on the Genesis, Sega CD, Master System, and Game Gear, and I'll be covering all of those except the Game Gear version eventually on here. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are confused about why I'm discussing the minutiae surrounding a video game that isn't technically listed in the title of the video. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where getting slightly off topic into video game minutia isn't a bug, it's a feature. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now, let's get back to the dilemma that Sunsoft was facing with the Batman license. While Sega may have pulled a fast one and gotten the license to produce a game based around the #1 movie of 1992, Sunsoft still technically had the rights to produce another Batman game. And they did, releasing a game with a fully original story, but featuring the villain that they knew best, Joker, in Batman, Revenge of the Joker, just about a month or so after Sega's Batman Returns, making the 1992 Christmas season a good one if you were a Genesis owner and a fan of the Caped Crusader. Well, with Sunsoft not releasing a Batman game based on the recent hit movie, they were going to have to pull off all the stops to really give gamers something special and to get everyone's attention. Now, were they able to release a successful follow-up to the original Batman? Or is Revenge of the Joker just a quick cash grab so that Sunsoft could take advantage of the wildly popular Batman license while he still had it? We shall see, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of Batman Revenge of the Joker for Genesis. This copy is in pretty decent shape. The outer cover is more or less fully intact, minus the hang tab at the top of the case, and the inner cover has held up well with no apparent water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear. If you're not familiar with the game, you might be surprised to find out that this is not a widely available game, and in fact, finding complete copies in the wild is something that I was never able to do, even though I looked for it for years at local shops. It seemed like the manual would always escape me, even if I happened to find one that was in the box. This is partially due to the fact that the game, just like last week's Goofy's Hysterical History Tour, is a North American exclusive and not available in any other region, I'm assuming due to licensing issues. If you happen to want to pick up a copy for your collection, expect to pay no less than $150 right now, and potentially more depending on the condition. Unlike Goofy's Hysterical History Tour, however, Batman Revenge of the Joker did see versions of the game on other platforms, so technically we do have some cover art to compare this to. It just happens to be on a different platform. You see, Revenge of the Joker was also released previously in 8-bit versions on the NES and the Game Boy, just under a slightly different name. As you can see from those covers, the Nintendo versions of the game were called Batman Return of the Joker instead. So essentially what we have is the old Star Wars Revenge of the Jedi versus Return of the Jedi, just in reverse. Now, why did the Genesis version get a different title? Well, my best guess is that goes back to the previously discussed Sega version of Batman Returns being released at almost the exact same time, and I'm sure Sega wanted to avoid confusion between the two and not have two games on the market with Batman and Return in the title at Christmas. It's a good theory anyway, I think. As far as comparing the art for those two Nintendo versions, I think I prefer the Genesis cover overall, with both Batman and Joker ready to throw down on that bright yellow background. But I must say that the NES art with Joker's Batman eyes and freakish smile is pretty iconic, and I definitely remember the ads featuring that cover in comic books from that time period even to this day. Flipping over the back, and, well, not a whole lot to discuss back here. It's pretty unusual to have a Genesis cover that doesn't at least feature screenshots, and in fact, the only one I can even think of off the top of my head is DJ Boy, which doesn't exactly put Revenge of the Joker in good company. At least the art is nice, I suppose, and it looks like something straight out of a comic book with the squirting flower gag and the stylized, oversized hammer. Opening up the box, and the manual has seen some use, but is intact. It's not the biggest manual in the world, but then again, this isn't a very complex game either, so there's not a whole ton that needs to be explained. The story, what little there is explained on page 2, and then there's a few pages on how to play the game, with a few screenshots and some art mixed in. On that last page, there's a list of all the levels in the game, and wouldn't you know it, but it looks like the previous owner decided to make notes of the passwords to get to all the levels. Well, up to level 4-2, that is. I wonder why that could be, he said as if to hint at something potentially bad in the future. Anyway, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see if Sunsoft was able to successfully follow up on their previous Bat effort. If you happen to see last week's review of Goofy's Hysterical History Tour, and honestly, I swear I was not expecting to reference that video nearly so much this week. It just kind of happened. Anyway, you might remember how I mentioned that game started out with a very long static screen cutscene, with a bunch of dialogue that laid out the backstory for the game and introduced the first level. Like, it was very long, almost 5 minutes worth. With Batman Revenge of the Joker, you might be expecting similar exposition about the goings-on of the game, especially with the game being based around comic book characters, and having cover art that looks like it comes straight from the magazine racks. Also, Sunsoft's previous Batman title featured similar cutscenes, acting out specific sequences from the movie, so there was previous history of that sort of thing being included to flesh out the game. Well, would you believe that Revenge of the Joker actually starts out with no cutscene? No dialogue and no story retelling or narration whatsoever. For whatever reason, any focus on story has totally been thrown out, and instead the game opens with a shot of Joker, and then Batman followed straight into the title screen. From there, you get your start menu, and assuming you're not putting in a password to continue your game, it's straight on to the action, with just a quick screen telling you what level you're on before throwing you into the fray against Joker's henchmen and whatever environmental dangers that particular level decides to throw at you. Now, I don't want people to think that I'm necessarily complaining about the lack of story here. This is an action game after all, and the title really tells you all you need to know, as it's a Batman game, and the Joker is out to get revenge for something. Actually, I suppose in that sense, the original name, Return of the Joker, probably makes more sense, because with Return of, you don't really have to explain why the Joker is returning, it's just that he's back for whatever reason. With Revenge of, that title implies the Joker is getting revenge for something, and it would be nice to be keyed into as to what specifically the Joker is seeking vengeance for. Did someone at the Gotham florist screw up his shipment of tripped flowers? Did they not have his shade of lipstick at the Gotham Ulta? Did Bruce Wayne not donate to his charity for upgrades to the Arkham Asylum cafeteria? We'll never know.
All that we do know is from the manual, and not even the back of the box this time around as we saw a few minutes ago, so those without the manual would be completely clueless here. But apparently what's going on is that precious metals are going missing at the Gotham mines, and with those metals being used for weapons of the explosive variety, it's assumed that the Joker must be responsible. So it's time for Batman to get his detective cowl on and figure out exactly what the Joker is up to. Now that I've spent more time talking about the game's backstory than the game itself does, I should probably discuss that game. With the lack of storytelling, you're launched straight into the action, and as much as it seems a little odd, there's another viewpoint here where it seems refreshing to just get right into things, as it gives the game a very arcade-like feel. And now looking back at it, that seems like exactly what new to the series developers Wellllll Studios was going for. Sunsoft's original Batman game was very much a side-scrolling action title, albeit with a few shooting levels thrown in to mix things up a bit. But I wouldn't have ever said that it felt like an arcade game necessarily. Revenge of the Joker, on the other hand, has some clear design changes that make it seem much more arcadey. The first change, and the one I think I'll talk about more in a minute, is Batman's larger presence, as opposed to the previous game. Just doing a quick comparison between the two games, Batman appears to be at least 50% larger in Revenge of the Joker, if not more. And it's not just Batman, most of the enemy sprites are much bigger now as well. Having those larger sprites, especially when it comes to the bosses, gives the game the look of something that you normally would have had to have dropped a quarter into play back in 1992. But then there's the structure of the actual game. And actually on the whole, it hasn't changed that much. There's still a similar amount of overall areas to navigate through, with Revenge of the Joker having 7 areas, which are all split into either 2 or 3 levels, depending on if that area has a boss or not. However, the levels now feel much shorter, and depending on the level and how well you know it, some can be gotten through very quickly. This is needed because Batman is unable to recover his health during a level, and if the levels were much longer, I'd have my doubts that most people would be able to survive long enough, not just on the limited health that Batman has, but also the very brief invincibility frames given to players. You'll have to be very careful about attempting to brute force your way through a section as a result, and while I respect that in some regards, it doesn't exactly make things easy at times. This potential for quick death, and if you're not paying attention and or familiar with the level, combined with the short levels definitely gives the game a feel of a quarter muncher from the arcades. And yes, for full disclosure, if you collect 8 energy capsules, you can get a brief few seconds of invulnerability, so it's not like you have no health assistance, but those energy capsules are few and far between, and they don't carry over to games when you use a password to continue. Thankfully, like in an arcade game, continues are infinite, and in a bonus bone thrown to players, each non-boss level has a very simple password, as shown earlier in the manual by the previous owner of this copy. This is important because you're going to be continuing and retrying levels a lot. The game doesn't have difficulty levels, so there's no making things easier on yourself. If you're having trouble getting through a level, you're just going to have to try again until either you get lucky or you memorize the best path through the level that allows you to take the fewest hits and barely eke out survival until the next. As far as that difficulty is concerned, I actually don't mind it. Batman starts out with a basic projectile for his wrist-mounted weapon, but you can grab one of 4 upgrades that each have different properties, with some being more useful than others in certain situations. And this combined with the platform-style gameplay gives the game a very Mega Man feel, especially since if you choose to duck and kick, you'll do a power slide in the direction that you're facing. But let me call back to the manual for a second. You remember how there were only passwords written down for the first 4 areas? Well, I think I know why that is. The boss for the 4th level is, as far as I know, only beatable if you have the Batarang equipped, and even then it can be a very tough fight. I ran into this firsthand as I tried to beat this boss for probably half an hour before I finally went to the internet to see what I was doing wrong. Due to that, I could totally see someone getting frustrated and giving up on the game at that point. Hence why there were no passwords written down past that point. Also, you may have noticed that there was no passwords written down for the bosses, and that's due to the fact that you can't continue from boss stages. If you die, you have to go back and complete the previous level again before trying to defeat the boss. Frustrating, but believe it or not my biggest issue here. See, there's a reason why it's designed this way. Due to the fact that you really need to have certain weapons to defeat some of the bosses, making you restart at that last level allows you to get the power-up that you need before fighting that boss. Because when you fight the boss, you carry in the last weapon that you had picked up, making it very critical to make sure that you grab the right weapon for the fight. None of that I really have a problem with, as it adds some strategy to having to think ahead and not just survive. Where the problem comes in is if you die against the boss, and say you made it to the boss with 2 lives left, well, you don't have that weapon anymore, and are left with just your basic attack, meaning that you might as well hit the reset button and try again, rather than waste your time using the wrong weapon. This seems like a very poor design choice to me, and with a very simple fix of allowing you to keep whatever weapon you had just for these boss fights. And unfortunately, it does hurt the game by pushing the game over the line from difficult to frustrating. From a purely technical standpoint, the game looks fantastic. I already mentioned how the game features those big arcade-esque sprites, but there's some other technical tricks that Wellllll Studios had up their sleeve too. Not only does the game feature parallax backgrounds, but there's also transparencies in not just the background, but the foreground as well. Of course, some of those foreground transparencies make it difficult to see which weapon you're grabbing, but I don't really want to hold that against it because it looks cool, and it's definitely not something that you see in every game. Along with that fancy programming, the game is simply very colorful, much more so than the original Batman, and definitely more so than your average Genesis title. You wouldn't know that lack of color was an issue for a large portion of the Genesis catalog by looking at this game. And not only is the game colorful, it's very detailed. There is more than a few places where there'll be lights flashing, gears rotating, or simply text labels to give the levels a more vibrant feel. And all of this is done without any flickering or slowdown, something that's notable considering that there's a few levels, like in the original, where platforming is eschewed in favor of what turns into a side-scrolling shooter. While the soundtrack isn't one that I would call my favorite necessarily, it is quite good. Which makes sense when you see that it's one of Tommy Tallarico's first efforts on the console. Now, you can mention his failures later in life all you want, but music was something he clearly had a talent for. His best work was still ahead of him, to be certain, but as far as early efforts go, I've certainly heard much worse. The sound effects aren't quite as impressive, but they're still decent, even if some of them sound like they may have been ripped off from other titles. Specifically, there's an explosion that sounds to be pulled directly from Sonic the Hedgehog. Batman Revenge of the Joker is a game that not only can it be frustrating to play in some places, it's frustrating for me to rate, simply because I want to give it a better score than it deserves. There's a reason why copies of the game sell for so much these days, and it's not just because it can be hard to find. Just from a technical perspective alone, there weren't a ton of games that looked and sounded like this in 1992, and especially not crammed into an 8 megabit cartridge. Unfortunately, due to how the game handles bosses, I can't justify giving the game anything higher than 3 stars. It's still an above average title to be sure, and Batman titles should definitely check it out, just maybe try it before you go to add it to your collection.
Okay, and that is it for Batman Revenge of the Joker. There's some things that I really enjoyed about playing the game this week, but unfortunately, they just didn't quite get the job done. And of course, it's tough when you're following up a game as good as the original Batman. As much as this game is flawed, I'm really curious as to which game I'm going to end up liking better, this or Sega's own Batman Returns. And of course, when I say Sega's own, in this case, I really mean Malibu Interactive's own. And as I've seen in previous Malibu Interactive titles like X-Mutants, Cliffhanger, and David Robinson's Supreme Court, their reputation precedes them a bit, and not in a good way. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's the big episode 250 extravaganza. How is the next episode going to be special? Well, okay, it's not. It's going to be like every other episode of Zilog and Moto. And in fact, it's probably going to be even worse because I can all but guarantee that next week's video is going to be One of the few, the proud, the games that end up getting 0 stars and being a total bomb. How can I be so sure? Well, let's just say that I've got previous experience with 2 games in this series, and I don't think that even the power of the RetroTink 4K is going to be able to help clean up this grainy mess. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 249. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.